I'd like to thank you for joining us today on this November the 11th, Veterans Day, or what was formerly known as Armistice Day, kind of a commemoration of a sad period in the world. But we're glad to have you joining us today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm. And what we're presenting today is talking about communication breakdown. It's always the same. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that is presented in conjunction with the New Jersey MEP, and we're sure you're going to enjoy the topic today. We invite you to become our friend. Firestorm Solutions is our name on Facebook. You can also follow us on Twitter. Firestorm Soul is our Twitter address, and there is a hashtag, and that hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value. Firestorm empowers you to manage risk and crises. The expertise of Firestorm is in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that the information today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments. The work product also must be read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. And this information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have a long ongoing relationship with the New Jersey MEP as part of presenting this Crisis Coach webinar series. Joe Caratanudo, our good friend at the NJMEP, is not able to be with us. He had some business to conduct in New York City. And Blair Neville likewise had some outside options that he had to take care of today. And our presenter is Harry Rulin. Harry is the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman and co-founder of Firestorm. Harry is an expert on the subject. He knows more about crisis communications than the rest of us have ever learned. So, Harry, over to you, please.
Well, Bill, thank you very much, and wow, that was quite the introduction. So I hope I can live up to everybody's expectations there. You know, this is a great topic, and I'm glad to be talking to the NJMEP today because communications in a crisis is something that I wind up dealing with a lot at Firestorm. It usually is, to some degree, always the same. You know, while the topic may be different, the vulnerability or the threat may be different, there's always things that happen in the same type of sequence. So I think today I want to focus a little bit on communication breakdowns, you know, what occurs when there is no plan, when the messages haven't been well thought out. So let's go right into it. You know, what do you do? A lot of you I've had the opportunity to speak with before, and you know that Firestorm follows a predict, plan, perform methodology. And one of the things that we always tell you guys is that you can predict what's coming. You know, can you identify your organization's next crisis? Yeah, you really can. I mean, if you sit down in a room with your people, you can probably write down almost every eventuality that could happen to your organization. And if you might not be able to say when they're going to happen, but you know that they could. And therefore, if you've got that kind of background, if you know what could happen, then you know where to start. You know what you can plan for. You can plan those communications. So for an incident of workplace violence or for a natural disaster or for whatever it might be that can affect your organization, you can develop an appropriate plan and the appropriate communication strategy. So why is crisis communications critical? I mean, I think everybody knows, and you've seen it on TV. You see it every night. You watch the news and you hear someone say something and you cringe because you just know they're going to wish they had never said it. You know, the idea that loose lips sink ships, you know, and especially today on Veterans Day, I think it's particularly appropriate. But they sink a lot more than ships because people don't stop and think. And I will tell you, in a crisis, that is one of the hardest things to do. One of the best services that Firestorm provides to any of its clients in a crisis is pulling hard on the reins. We literally just slow everybody down so that their brains can start to think in a more normal fashion, because otherwise, if you go out and speak without having thought everything through, while it may seem like the right thing to do in that exact moment, if you haven't thought of the consequences of what you're about to say, you're making a big mistake. So one of the things that I always encourage clients to do in a crisis is ask why. Why am I going to say what I'm about to say? Why am I going to put in writing, or why am I going to make an announcement or a press release or whatever it might be to a particular constituent group? And a lot of the times, a client won't have the answer to the question why. They're just reacting, and reacting can be tremendously dangerous. So we need to talk more about that, and we will as this webinar goes on. So again, this is the Firestorm methodology, and it seems pretty simple. Predict, plan, perform. The problem is you're all so good at your jobs, and you know your businesses so well, that your initial inclination is to jump right to perform. You see a problem, and you want to fix it. And unfortunately, when you do that, you skip a lot of thought process and a lot of steps that might help you avoid potential problems in the future. So you're making a statement which you think is going to make your shareholders or your employees or somebody feel better, and you haven't thought about the impact that it might have on regulators or unions or some other thing, which you then have to live with the statement that you made. So again, slowing down, taking the time and the discipline to predict what are all the vulnerabilities and threats that this new situation has created. What is my plan? How am I going to speak to all of the different constituents? Who is going to speak? So the right person to speak to your unions or to your regulators may be a very different person than the person who's going to speak to your employees, your shareholders, your customers. So it's especially important in a crisis to slow down, take those few minutes. I can guarantee you, while in your brain you think that you don't have the time, you really do. And that's a discipline, again, that comes, and a lot of times that's what crisis managers get brought in for. That's what Firestorm gets brought into a crisis for, because we can take an objective third-party view. It's not our crisis. Yes, we're on your team, and yes, we're going to help you solve that crisis, but we're going to help slow you down and bring that discipline. If you don't bring in someone like Firestorm, have someone in your organization who's appointed with that task. The person who's responsible for always asking why, the person who's trying to slow you down all the time. It can be especially important to a successful outcome of any crisis. So how do you do that? Well, obviously the predictive piece you need to know. Who are we talking to? What are their specific concerns? What is it that we need to get across to them? Tailor the message, the messenger, and the methodology, the media by which you transmit it. You got to keep in mind, if you're going to put out a message in writing, so you're going to do an email, a text, a letter, whatever it might be to a particular constituent group, you've got to remember that once you put it in writing, it lives forever. In today's world, once it's out there, be sure it's going to be, even if you put it in handwriting, it's going to be transcribed and it's going to be on the internet, and it lives forever. So make sure you format to the stakeholder. Most of the time in a crisis, if it's sensitive information, we advise not putting it in writing. If you can make a phone call, if you can call together a meeting, and keep in mind, even that is not a guarantee, because almost every meeting, somebody's going to have their phone on with their voice recorder, so it's going to be transcribed. Again, a lot of times someone's videotaping it with their phone, and before the meeting's even over, it's out there on YouTube or Facebook. So you need to think really carefully about every word you say, and especially every word that you write. And again, you've heard us say this many times, focus on 3 key messages at the most. In a crisis, people can't absorb a lot of information. In general, they can't, but even less so in a crisis, because the brain is going in so many different directions. 3 short, very concise key messages, no more than that. So, communications in a crisis is very difficult. And the reason for that is that a crisis evolves, and it evolves very often quickly. So there's an escalating flow of events, and very often they happen in ways that you don't expect. So you don't have accurate information. The amount of information you're getting is insufficient. Very often the information that you're getting is just wrong. It's inaccurate. So you think that one thing occurred, and then you find out a few minutes later that it actually was something else, or some other person was involved. So you got to be very careful anytime you start a sentence with "I think" or "we believe." When you start sentences that way, you're about to say something which is not necessarily fact, but an interpretation of the information that you've received. And that can be very dangerous. So I'll talk a little bit more about that further on. But anytime you catch yourself saying those kind of things, "I think," "I believe," "we believe," stop yourself, because you're about to say something which, if it turns out to be wrong, will color every other statement that you've made and make people question your credibility. And I think that the questioning of credibility gets to that next issue of intense scrutiny. You know, during a crisis, everyone is looking, what did you do? What did you do wrong? Who did something wrong? They're looking for the problem. So the scrutiny goes up tremendously by everyone: regulators, employees, unions, shareholders, everybody, clients. So you've got to be prepared for that higher level of scrutiny. One of the things that also happens in a crisis, depending on what it is, if you've had a fire, an explosion, you've had an incidence of workplace violence, there's a tremendous loss of command and control, because the fire department or the police department, when they get on scene, they take over your location. They have the authority to actually come in and be in control of your physical assets. That's a real problem and a real issue that you need to address in your test exercises. You need for people to feel and understand that you're not going to have complete access to all of your people, your buildings, your process, your procedure. You've got to include that, and very often we advise that you include the local police department, the local fire department in your test exercises, because they love it, they want to participate, and it will help you more realistically understand what it's going to be like to try and communicate and to try and manage your business in those kind of crisis scenarios. Very often, this next thing says how you respond can create a second crisis. We see that all the time. Someone will say something or do something that they wish they hadn't, which of course becomes the next crisis. The initial crisis, the explosion or the fire, that goes away pretty quick. But again, you can't take back something you've written, something you've said that winds up on the television, that winds up on the internet. You wind up with tremendous brand and reputation exposure. You have people that make statements that are misinterpreted or that were based on things they thought were fact that turn out not to be, and it creates a real significant problem for the organization down the road. And again, I think remembering that every crisis is a human crisis. People are people. People are going to say and do things in a crisis that are totally unexpected. So going back to the issue of test exercises, you've got to put people in that environment on a regular basis, because otherwise you just don't know how they're going to perform. Some people perform stellar in a crisis. Other people, you're going to be shocked how they close down or they behave in a way which you just never would have expected based on their normal day-to-day personality. So I very much encourage you to conduct test exercises as often as possible. And again, this is a place where you need to bring in a third party, like a Firestorm, because you can't have the people who designed your emergency preparedness plans, your crisis management plans, your business continuity plans, all of the different planning that you do, your supply chain planning. If the same people who designed the plans are the ones who are testing the plans, you can be sure you're going to pass 100% all of the time. That really doesn't tell you a lot. So even if you don't bring in a third party, have a different department, a different division do the test exercise, and also pull important people out so that they're not part of the exercise, to see what would happen if someone was on vacation or, God forbid, somebody was actually involved in the event. So the process of crisis communications and the process in general of creating those messages so that you can communicate accurately with your constituents is actually fairly simple. Again, following that predict, plan, perform methodology. The predictive piece, you have to factually assess the situation and determine whether there is communications that need to occur. You need to implement, but you got to be careful about that where it says immediate actions. Immediate means immediately after you're prepared to do it. So start identifying who are your key audiences. Align the messages and the message maps to those key audiences. So again, here in peacetime, you've seen in other presentations that Jim has done and that I've done with you, we put up a picture of a calendar. You know, right now you can schedule a meeting with your people for next week and say, hey, look, we're going to get together next week to talk about our hurricane plan. And we're going to talk about the messages and we're going to pre-script those for all of our audiences. Well, now when the time comes that you need to use them, you can pull them out, you can align the specific message to the audience, and you can make sure that you're delivering it properly. You can monitor the facts to see whether things are changing in a way that you didn't expect. You can communicate to the stakeholder as required. Keep in mind, just because you have a constituent doesn't mean they need to be communicated with all at the same time. Some need information immediately. So in an emergency response scenario, the employees are going to need information instantaneously. Whereas a shareholder or someone else can wait until the situation unravels to the point where you know what's going on, as opposed to giving them misinformation or incomplete information. One of the things we try to do is minimize rumors. So putting fact out there in front of people will help a lot. And it will help them not get out there and start spreading misinformation where on social media especially. And we'll talk a little bit more about social media monitoring and the things that you need to do in those situations. So I advise you to conduct debriefs as needed. So your senior management staff, anyone who's going to be going out and interfacing with any of your other constituents, they need to be debriefed regularly as the situation evolves. Ask for assistance if needed. This is really a situation, typically when some type of crisis occurs at a business or any organization, the first couple of calls that get made are to your lawyer, your insurance agent, and hopefully to Firestorm. Because if we're on notice and we know something's going on, we're ready to jump in and help much more quickly. So even if you don't think you're going to need assistance, even if you're pretty sure you have the situation under control, because keep in mind, crises escalate, just call, let us know what's going on. It's not going to cost you anything, and maybe we're just going to give you that little bit of additional support that you need so that you don't make that error that you wish you had never made. So I think we've done that for several of the organizations in the MEP, and we would love to be involved in any way that we can be helpful. One of the things that all of you need to have in place as part of your preparedness planning is what we call an event activation matrix. It's the kind of thing where it tells you who gets to make what decisions and when. So for example, a minor event, low impact. You've had a slip and fall in the parking lot. Maybe you need to call 911. Maybe you don't. It's the kind of thing that can be handled at the plant level. Whereas an incident, depending on its significance, how adverse it is, what the impact area of the event is, and who's impacted, an incident may or may not require that you alert your central office or whomever. It tells you all of the messaging, the responsibilities, who has to be notified. So all that's there, because the last thing you want when something occurs, especially if it's a true business crisis, the last thing you want somebody trying to figure out is, what do I do? Who do I call? What do I say? Be sure that in that environment, a mistake is going to get made, and hopefully not one that affects the brand and reputation of your organization long term. But unfortunately, a lot of the times that is what we see. So again, thinking of the communication cycle, thinking of predict, plan, perform, the communication cycle, information gathering, that's predictive work. Drafting, that's planning work. Going and getting the approval, that's part of the plan. Now you distribute it, you're performing. Now you have to manage the inquiries as they come in. External monitoring, we're going to talk more about that because again, in today's world, more and more and more communication is taking place via social media, and more so now even text messaging, and unfortunately, in my opinion, via emojis. It's not even written text anymore. It's pictographs. It's almost like we're going back to the caveman era where we're scratching pictures on the wall. But that being said, it all becomes a circle because once you've gathered that external information, it goes back into the information gathering stage because you may need to then start drafting again. So it all goes in a circle, and it's important that you control that process. Somebody's got to be on that all the time. So how do you know what's being said or being heard by those out there? This is what I was just referring to, your whole predictive intelligence process. So any newsworthy event that happens, any crisis, it attracts traditional print and electronic media, but also continuous social media interaction. Your people, other people, news services are out there asking your people during a crisis, even during a workplace violence scenario or a lockdown or anything else, we see the media encouraging people to communicate while it's going on. Very dangerous and something that you need to be aware of. Firestorm has a division that our predictive intelligence people, we actually live real time are monitoring during a crisis on behalf of our clients what's going on out there, looking for certain phrases, keywords, things of that nature, so that we can help you know what people are thinking and what people are saying. So it's really critical once you've identified a situation within your organization that you be looking. I will also tell you, this is something you should be doing during peacetime. You will be surprised how often your people telegraph bad intent. So we actually were doing this work on behalf of one of the nation's largest companies and found in one of their warehouses, one of their distribution centers, an employee who was putting information out there about his bad intent while he was on his work shift. So I think it's really important that all of you think about what your predictive intelligence process looks like. If that's something you want to talk about with Firestorm, we would love to talk to you about it because we've got people that this is all they do all day, every day, and they know the cutting-edge response to this issue. So, let us know if we can help with that. There are various crisis communication components that, we talked in the beginning about how it's all the same. There are certain things that are almost always the same. So if you've had a crisis that involves some type of injury, whether it be a physical injury to someone or an injury to their business as a result of something that occurred within your business, you need to express the appropriate concern. Sometimes that's support or condolences to families or whatever it might be. Again, we have to think about how that happens. Sending somebody an email or a text may be perceived as very impersonal versus a telephone call or in many cases a face-to-face visit. So we need to think about that. One of the things we at Firestorm always recommend in crisis scenarios is that you engage us through your counsel. A lot of what will occur in a crisis may be protectable under attorney-client privilege if we anticipate that there's going to be litigation as a result of it. So if the work that we're doing is in contemplation of litigation, very often the work that we do can be protected under the attorney-client privilege, which makes it harder for it to become public information. So I think that's really important. We say establish the tell the truth baseline. Obviously, you're always going to tell the truth. In some cases, you're not necessarily going to divulge complete information or necessarily any information at all. But never are you going to attempt to mislead or put out information that's not 100% correct. Because be sure that always that will come back to haunt you. Again, the issue of consequence management versus crisis management. So that's an important thing for everyone in your organization to understand. You know, when we did the work at Virginia Tech after the shootings there, we came up with a few themes that you see here that work almost universally in crisis. The first one is that we are not going to be defined by this event. So the fact that we've had a situation with workplace violence, or we've had a food safety issue or whatever it might be, that's not who we are. That's not what our organization is about. We won't be defined by it. We are going to invent the future. We're going to learn from the situation. We're going to change. We're going to make appropriate adjustments. And we are going to be responsible for inventing the future of our organizations. And we're going to embrace the families. Now, the families may be your employees. The families may be any constituent. I mean, it doesn't have to be necessarily family in the traditional sense of the word. We've already talked about, the focus on why communicate. It's very, very important that you think about why. Very often everyone thinks that it's a requirement, that you have to do it. And it's really not a requirement that we communicate this minute. A lot of times you'll communicate, and it doesn't have to be now. The communication would be better 12 hours from now when we have complete information. So think about that very carefully, because it is about both the listener or the reader, but it's also about the communicator. If the communicator is in a situation where they don't have complete information, where they're not feeling comfortable with what they need to say, they will almost undoubtedly say something that we wish they hadn't. So, the things that I was just referring to on the previous slide, on this slide where it says not to be defined by the event, invent the future, and embrace the families, those are the things that we use to create home bases. Home bases are very well thought out, pre-prepared theme statements that can be used in a crisis. And, so they talk about things like the XYZ company has been in business for 150 years. We've been serving the community. We employ 270 people. Things that tell information about your organization that you want people to know. But what they also are is there are statements that you memorize, that they become part of your normal speech pattern that you can use to give yourself time to think. So that when you get asked a question that you don't want to answer, or that really requires careful consideration, you can say something which then gives you time to construct an answer that's more appropriate to the question. It's a crisis communications, and especially crisis communications in a public environment, is a skill, and it's one that you have to work on. It's one that you have to develop. Developing these home bases in advance will give you a lot of confidence in your ability to do that. So I very much encourage all of you to work on what the home bases would be for your organization. And again, base them around those themes of not being defined by the event, of inventing the future for your organization, and of taking care of the constituents who are your people. So if you need any help with doing that kind of thing, never hesitate to call us. We'd be more than happy to talk you through the process of creating home bases. So again, I already mentioned that at Virginia Tech, these were the ones that we used. They work tremendously well. I can't tell you how many times, once we taught this to the students, the faculty, and the staff, how many times we saw them in interviews using variations of these themes. It's an important thing to do, and it's something that you can all do now as part of the predictive work and the planning work that you're going to do so that you are prepared when something occurs. So let's talk a little bit about message mapping. You know, I said earlier in the presentation that right now you have the time to sit down with your people and determine what are the types of events that can occur that would be adverse to your organization. Once you know what those events are, you can write down a list of pretty much every question that any of your constituents are going to ask. And if you know what the questions are, you can develop a clear communication for that particular stakeholder. You can determine what tool you're going to use for delivering it. You can determine who's going to deliver it. You can determine what the trigger is for when that message is going to be released. Because again, not all messages get released at the same time. So you actually chart in a message map the detail of how, excuse me, of how that's going to occur. So again, it's a pretty simple process. Always think, predict, plan, perform. So part of your predictive work, what do you want the audience to know? It's important that the information you give them either gives them accurate information or corrects misperceptions or erroneous information. Prepare those messages that are key to you. What are the talking points you want them to know? You want them to support all of your message maps. You want those answers to be based on those key messages. You want them consistent with the core values of your organization. You want them consistent with those home bases so that it all forms a cohesive net of communications. And you'll see that as you start doing it, as you start sitting down with your people, it's all going to start to follow a common theme. One thing that I really must emphasize is you have to keep the messages simple. They have to be simple. They have to be short, because in a crisis, the person delivering them will never remember. Because in the back of their mind, that crisis is still going to be going on, and it's very hard to keep a long message in mind. Very often, we're going to want to document in writing the recommended messages and the delivery channels. I mean, you're going to want to have that whole crisis communications process mapped, because I can tell you, when the crisis happens, things will occur and make it very difficult to think. When I say practice the delivery, this last one on the page, I can't emphasize that more. If you've never gotten up in front of a room and spoke, if you've never talked to groups of your shareholders or employees, it's very important to do that during your test exercises, because you will be shocked how difficult it is in peacetime. So imagine trying to do it when things are really difficult. So again, you'll see at the top of this message map, it says, before distributing any message, ask yourself why you're doing it. I keep emphasizing why. I cannot tell you how important it is to know why you're trying to answer a question. Because if you can't answer that question, or if the answer when you're giving it sounds like an answer where you could say, hey, look, you know, we can really wait till the fire's out before we talk to this particular constituent group, then the answer is we're not going to do it now, because we're going to have much more complete information, you know, an hour from now, a day from now, a week from now, and you need to determine what is the appropriate timing to deliver that message. Now, as you can see, this lays out how you do a message map. So what is the question or concern? What is the impact? Who is the particular stakeholder that needs to receive it? And then what are the key messages and the medium by which they're going to be distributed? And keep in mind, you'll see in the text there, it says do not provide all three messages at once. That is absolutely right. You cannot start rapid firing at people multiple messages. So think about that. You know, you give one message, then you've got to give people time to digest them. A lot of times they're going to then ask a question, which you'll use another one of the messages to answer. So again, pulling back on those reins, slowing yourself down. There's always an inclination during crisis to speak very quickly. Try not to do that. as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what you're going to find out during the first 24 hours is going to be wrong. Be careful about that. Do not release information that you're not 100% sure is 100% factually correct, because things will change. Almost invariably, you will find out that you'll say something that will turn out to be wrong. You know, you'll say something like, we always do X, Y, and Z, and then you'll find out, hey, wait a minute, we forgot to do Z this time. So don't make statements that you don't know are correct, because what you find in the following days, weeks, months, years is that there are consequences to your statement that you didn't predict or didn't expect. And consequence management is really what this is all about. Crisis management, when the explosion occurs, when the workplace violence incident is going on, that's the crisis. But it's over very quickly. And once it's over, we're dealing with the consequences. So just be very careful about that thought process. Just always, always remember, stop. Literally stop. Think really hard. Ask why. What are we doing? Because that urge to react, that urge to respond is so overwhelming that very often we make significant errors. We make mistakes that could have been avoided because we move too quickly. Rarely will you be criticized for moving too slowly, but very often the consequences of moving too quickly will manifest themselves in brand and reputation damage for a long period of time. So, next steps. Do you know what will happen tomorrow? Can you afford to not know? I think those are the kind of things, we talked about predictive intelligence. You have to be monitoring what's going on out there. Your customers, your employees, everyone in your communications chain are out there communicating, and a lot of it you can know right now. So I really urge you to do that. One of the big areas of risk that Firestorm is working on now with a lot of you is cyber risk. The whole idea that there is not a company in America that is not subject to the exposure of cyber hacking. We at Firestorm help create cyber response plans. There's no one that in Firestorm that does firewall building or the actual IT piece. We approach cyber as a business problem. And I think all of you need to look at it that way, because when you consider that the White House, the FBI, the U.S. Army, all of these organizations have been hacked, as the FBI says, it's not a question of what kind of organizations in America haven't been. They say there are two kinds of organizations, those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. So it's really important that you have a cyber response plan in place, and we are going to do 2 cyber risk exercises. They're free. They're being sponsored by several other organizations that are bringing them to all of you. One on December 8th, one on December 14th. Your whole team can participate. You can actually test your cyber response plan against a real exercise. In real time, you'll be able to ask the experts questions. It's going to be a pretty cool thing. So I would urge all of you, go to our website, find out, sign up for one of those. I'm not sure. I don't think either the 8th or the 14th exercise are full yet, but there are already several hundred organizations that have signed up. So I would urge you all to do that. It's important that you do align your plans to best practices, not just your cyber plans, but your crisis communications plans and other things. We are happy to help you with that. Definitely design that intelligence network, that predictive intelligence that I was talking about. It's so important. We can schedule for your individual organization or your groups crisis coach training and crisis communications training. Again, you need to do those things now in peacetime, because you are going to be surprised what it feels like to try and do them when the seconds really count. Right now, we can talk about it, we can take our time, and we've just spent 40 minutes together talking about these things. In a crisis, we're not going to have that luxury. So really take that step, make sure that someone in your organization is always pushing, where are we with our test exercise? Where are we with the next phase of our planning? Always have something on the calendar where you're going to be working on the next thing. You can go to our website. You can download the brief from this webinar, but I think you also all know there are many, many other things there, webinar extracts and other things that will be interesting on a multitude of topics. So I want to thank the New Jersey MEP for sponsoring these things. It's always wonderful to get together with your group, and you know how to contact us, obviously. Most of you participate in webinars with us regularly. Don't hesitate to call us 24/7. We literally are working on crisis assignments. Unfortunately, crises don't occur on a schedule. So very often we're getting calls on weekends, we're getting called at night. That's what we do. Do not hesitate. If something is bothering you, it's in, something in the back of your brain, the pit of your stomach, call us. We can help. So, Bill, I don't know, with that, do you have anyone who's asked any questions? We have a couple of minutes. I think we could still take a question if there is any.
So one comment, there are two kinds of companies that know that they've been hacked, and companies they know your quote, that they have been hacked.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, and you think about the type of organizations that have been penetrated by the various hackers around the world, I mean, you would imagine that the FBI or the White House or some of these organizations would have the most sophisticated anti-hacking firewall protection in the world. That's IT deals with that. Those guys are dealing with that every day, and they're doing their best. But one of the biggest risks to business, and you guys have heard me say this before, is the rate of change. The problem is technology changes at such an exponential rate that the hackers are always one step ahead. So what we have to know is, what is it that we're going to do? What's our cyber response plan for when we realize we've been hacked? Because that's what's going to determine the long-term brand and reputation impact on our organization. So I very much encourage every one of you to participate in the exercise that we're going to have and learn about where your organization is in terms of your preparedness, because this is one of those issues that is life-threatening to an organization. I mean, if you saw what Target and Home Depot and some of these other organizations went through, the cost of that kind of a situation, if you're not prepared for it, can be so detrimental it could literally put your organization out of business. I saw an interesting thing, Bill, just recently, that the first mailing, just the mailing that Home Depot sent out to all of the people who were potentially impacted, the stamps on those mailings cost $22.4 million. So, imagine your organization, even though you're not the size of Home Depot, having to send out that first mailing to notify people, because that mailing is required by law. Even if it's not 22 million, what if it's 2.4 million for your organization? Do you have cyber liability insurance in place? I mean, that's something we can absolutely help you understand and work your way through, because every organization must have cyber liability insurance at this point. So again, nobody should hesitate to call us and talk about those kind of issues. And I think with that, Bill, we've about used up our time.
We have. So, and thank you very much, Harry. Always appreciate your comments and insight. And
well, it's my pleasure.
And we look forward to talking to all of you on the webinar next month. And be sure to go to firestorm.com to sign up for the virtual cyber risk exercise. This is, in fact, a celebration of the 10th anniversary of Firestorm. Harry, do you want to say anything about our 10th anniversary?
Well, it's hard to imagine that we've already gone through 10 years, but yeah, it's we've come a long way. We've worked with so many organizations and done so many great things. I think one of the things we're always trying to do on behalf of our clients and our potential future clients is understand what the future of risk is. So, we just talked a little bit about cyber. We identified cyber a couple of years ago as an up-and-coming and major issue. We are going to continue to try and put all of those kind of things out in front of everybody for the next 10 years. And we urge all of you, participate as much as possible. get as many of the people in your organization involved, and especially get your senior management, all the way up to the board level, involved in understanding that preparedness is a cultural issue and it must come from the top down. So, we look forward to the next 10 years with all of you, and thank you for joining us today.
Okay. Goodbye, all.
Bye-bye.